Those who worked the floor at the Onyx Room understood 3 fundamental rules. Keep the champagne flowing, never repeat what you overhear, and when Michael Duran reserves a table, pray you're scheduled off. Laura Brennan had survived 2 years by following those rules without question, moving through the restaurant like smoke, knowing that one mistake could cost more than her job. But the night Michael walked in with a Rottweiler on a chrome chain, every rule became meaningless. Because that wasn't just Chicago's most feared mafia boss entering the dining room. That was the guard dog from her prison, Jack, the same beast who'd sat outside her cell door for 2 years while she was trafficked. The same animal who'd watched her give birth on a concrete floor and done nothing when they took her baby. The same monster who'd been trained to kill anyone who tried to help her escape. Michael's tattooed hand gripped the chain like a weapon. His guards spread out across the entrance, and Jack's massive head turned slowly, scanning the room with predator focus until his black eyes locked onto Laura's. The recognition was instant, mutual, terrifying. And when a busboy's tray crashed and Jack launched toward his throat, Laura had one impossible choice: run and save herself, or step between them and sing the lullaby that used to keep the beast quiet when she sobbed in the dark. She chose the song, and nothing would ever be the same. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. Now that you're relaxed and ready to unwind, please subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Tomorrow brings another soft, comforting tale. Now, let's continue quietly with Laura's story. The crash of shattering crystal ripped through the Onyx Room like a gunshot at a funeral. One moment, the restaurant hummed with the refined murmur of Chicago's elite, discussing million-dollar deals over Wagyu beef and aged wine. The next, a new busboy's trembling hands lost their grip on a silver tray stacked with champagne flutes, and the elegant silence exploded into chaos. Glass hit imported marble with a percussion that made every patron flinch, every server freeze mid-step, every security guard's hand drift toward concealed weapons. Jack didn't flinch. The Rottweiler's massive head snapped toward the sound with predator focus, his scarred ears pinning flat against his skull. For one suspended heartbeat, the beast stood completely still, processing the noise, categorizing the threat level. Then his lips peeled back from teeth designed to crush bone, and he launched. The leather leash went taut in Michael Duran's tattooed hand, the chrome chain singing with dangerous tension as 120 pounds of scar tissue and killing instinct committed to violence. The busboy stumbled backward, his face draining of color, his hands coming up in a futile gesture of protection. He appeared young, terrified, his survival instincts kicking in too late. Michael cursed in rapid Italian, his grip tightening on the leash, biceps straining against his tailored jacket as he fought to control the beast. But Jack had already locked onto his target, already calculated the trajectory, already tasted blood that hadn't been spilled yet. Chairs scraped against marble as patrons in $1,000 suits scrambled backward, champagne glasses toppling, appetizers forgotten. A woman wearing enough diamonds to buy a car screamed, her manicured hand flying to her throat. The sommelier pressed himself against the wine cellar door, eyes wide with the kind of primal fear that transcended social class. Security personnel moved with fluid precision, reaching for weapons they technically weren't supposed to have, waiting for the order to neutralize the threat. And Laura moved. Not away from danger, toward it. Her body betrayed every survival instinct she'd carefully cultivated over 2 years of hiding, every rule she'd memorized to stay invisible and safe. Her legs carried her forward on autopilot, muscle memory overriding rational thought, trauma-wired reflexes taking control. She crossed the dining room in 4 running steps, her sensible work shoes crunching through broken crystal, her stained apron flying behind her. She didn't think about the consequences, didn't calculate the risk, didn't consider that stepping between a mafia boss and his attack dog might be the last decision she ever made. Laura dropped to her knees between the Rottweiler and the terrified busboy, so close to Jack's snarling face that she could smell the sulfur on his breath, could see the white ring of rage around his dilated pupils, could count the scars that crisscrossed his muzzle like a roadmap of violence. The beast was mid-lunge, airborne, jaws already opening for the killing bite. She had maybe half a second before those teeth found flesh. She didn't reach for him, didn't try to grab his spiked collar or push him back. Those actions would only trigger deeper attack protocols, instincts that had been beaten into him until they became automatic. Instead, Laura did the only thing that had ever worked in the basement. She opened her mouth and began to sing. Lavender blue, dilly dilly, lavender green. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. The melody drifted across the shocked silence, haunting and broken. A lullaby about safety and gardens and sunshine, everything that Concrete Cell had stolen from both of them. When I am king, dilly dilly, "You shall be queen." The effect was instantaneous and impossible. Jack froze mid-attack, his massive body suspended in the air for one gravity-defying moment before crashing to the marble floor. His jaws hung open, strings of saliva connecting his teeth like spider silk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The killing rage that had burned in his black eyes flickered, sputtered, and died, replaced by something far more disturbing than aggression: recognition, memory, the kind of trauma-bonded connection that transcended training and instinct. His scarred ears flattened against his skull. A violent tremor seized his muscular frame, starting at his shoulders and radiating down his spine to his tail. And then the monster that had hospitalized 3 men last month, the beast that struck fear into hardened criminals, the weapon that Michael Duran wielded like a loaded gun, collapsed. Not with dignity, not with grace. He crumbled like a building, with its foundation destroyed, his legs folding beneath him as if someone had severed the tendons. Then he crawled. Jack dragged himself across the dining room floor on his belly, leaving streaks of blood where shattered crystal cut into his skin. He crawled through the mess he'd created, past the frozen busboy, past Michael's expensive shoes, until he reached Laura's knees. The massive Rottweiler pressed his scarred head against her stained apron and whimpered. The sound was wrong, completely at odds with his size and reputation. It was pitiful, broken, almost human in its grief, like a child begging for forgiveness from the only person who'd ever shown him mercy in hell. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye in the Onyx room was locked on the impossible scene unfolding in the center of the dining room. The security team stood with hands inside their jackets, fingers on triggers, waiting for orders that didn't come. The manager gripped the edge of the host stand, his knuckles white, his face drained of color as he tried to calculate how to explain this to his investors. Patrons sat frozen with forks halfway to their mouths, their brains struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. The sommelier had stopped breathing entirely. But Michael Duran saw only Laura. He stood frozen, the slack leash dangling from his tattooed hand, his dark eyes fixed on the woman kneeling in broken glass and spilled champagne. He was a man who'd built an empire on reading people, on detecting weakness and exploiting fear, on knowing when someone was lying before they opened their mouth. And everything about Laura Brennan was wrong. She wasn't looking at Jack with the wonder of someone who'd just performed a miracle. She was looking at him with the clinical detachment of someone checking a weapon's safety mechanism. Her hands moved automatically through the dog's fur, finding old scars with practiced efficiency, checking his ribs, examining his paws for injuries she somehow knew would be there. She wasn't petting a dog. She was conducting an inspection. "You're not a waitress," Michael said, his voice low and rough, cutting through the shocked silence like a knife through flesh. Every word carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of tone that had ordered executions and launched wars. His accent thickened with intensity, Italian vowels bleeding through the English consonants. "Who are you?" Laura looked up at him, and for the first time in 2 years of carefully cultivated invisibility, she let the mask slip. Her dark eyes met his, and in that suspended moment, Michael saw everything she'd been hiding, the trauma that lived in the tightness around her mouth, the rage that simmered beneath her compliant smile, the survivor who'd learned to wear a waitress uniform like camouflage, blending into the background of other people's dangerous lives. He saw a woman who'd been broken and put herself back together with nothing but spite and determination. And he saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. She knew his dog, not the way someone knows a famous attack animal from news reports. She knew Jack the way you know your cellmate, the way you know your jailer. Laura's hands were still buried in Jack's fur, her fingers trembling against his warm skin. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't lifted his head from her lap, hadn't acknowledged Michael's presence at all. For a beast trained to respond only to his master's commands, the betrayal was absolute. And Michael, who'd inherited this animal from his father along with the family business, who'd never been able to touch the dog without risking his hand, who'd kept Jack more as a symbol of power than a pet, felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. "I asked you a question," Michael said, taking a step closer. His security team shifted with him, a coordinated movement that spoke of years working together. "And in my experience, people who don't answer questions have something to hide." Laura's throat worked, her lips parting, but no sound came out. What could she possibly say? That she'd spent 2 years in a basement with this dog? That she'd sung him lullabies to keep him from alerting her captors when she cried? That she'd watched him pace outside her cell door while men hurt her in ways that still woke her up screaming? That she'd given birth on concrete while Jack sat guard, doing nothing, saying nothing, Just watching with those same black eyes? The truth was impossible. But lies were dangerous. And silence, in Michael Duran's world, was an admission of guilt. The restaurant remained frozen, every breath held, every heartbeat loud in the crystalline quiet. The manager made a small gesture toward the kitchen, and staff began to move in slow motion, carefully clearing patrons from nearby tables, creating distance from whatever was about to happen. Because everyone who worked in this world understood that when Michael Duran asked a question, you answered, or you disappeared. Laura had survived 2 years of hell by reading Dangerous Men, by understanding when compliance meant survival and when silence meant death. But as she knelt in broken glass with her hands on her nightmare and Michael Duran's shadow falling across her like a shroud, she realized something terrifying. There was no right answer, only choices that would change everything. So she made one. I used to know a dog like him, Laura whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. A long time ago, in a place I'm trying to forget. It wasn't quite a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. It was the kind of careful half-answer that might buy her time, might keep her breathing, might prevent Michael from looking too closely at the scars she kept hidden beneath her uniform. Jack whimpered at the sound of her voice, pressing harder against her knees, and Laura felt her carefully constructed life crumbling around her like the shattered crystal at her feet. Because the dog had just told Michael everything she'd tried to hide. This wasn't a coincidence. This was recognition. This was history. This was proof. Michael's eyes narrowed, his sharp mind already assembling pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. He looked at his dog, trembling and submissive in a stranger's lap. He looked at Laura, her hands moving through Jack's fur with the unconscious competence of repetition. He looked at the blood on the floor, the shocked faces around them, the impossible scene that defied everything he knew about his father's attack dog. And Michael Duran, who'd built an empire on asking the right questions, asked the one that would unravel everything. Where? His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it filled the entire restaurant. Where did you know a dog like mine? Laura's hand stilled in Jack's fur. Her breath caught, and in the space between heartbeats, she made a choice that would either save her or destroy her. She looked Michael Duran directly in the eye and told him the truth he wasn't ready to hear. In a basement, she said, her voice steady despite the terror flooding her veins. In a basement where men kept girls in cages, where this dog sat outside our cells and made sure we never got out. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Michael's face went carefully blank, the kind of expressionless mask that meant his mind was racing through implications and consequences. His security team tensed, hands tightening on concealed weapons. The manager looked like he might faint, and Jack, the monster who'd terrorized Chicago's underworld, pressed his scarred face harder against Laura's apron and whimpered like he was begging for absolution. That's impossible, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Because he was looking at the evidence, watching his father's attack dog submit to a waitress in a way he'd never submitted to anyone. My father got this dog from a breeder in... He stopped, because even as the lie formed on his tongue, pieces were clicking into place. The scars on Jack's body that had never been explained. The way the dog responded to certain sounds with blind panic. The basement level of the family estate that his father had always kept locked. The nephew who'd appeared suddenly with a story about a dead cousin. Oh God, the nephew. You need to come with me, Michael said, his tone shifting from interrogation to something else entirely. Command. Urgency. Maybe even fear. Now, we're leaving. He wasn't asking. Laura's survival instincts screamed at her to run, to refuse, to do anything except get into a car with a mafia boss. But Jack was already standing, positioning himself between Laura and the exit, not aggressive, just blocking. Hurting, the way he'd been trained. And Laura realized with sick certainty that she'd just traded one prison for another. The only question was whether Michael Duran was her captor or the key to the truth she'd been hunting for 2 years. The truth about what happened to her baby. The truth about who really ran the trafficking ring. The truth that might be buried somewhere in the Duran family estate. So when Michael extended his hand to help her stand, Laura took it. And as his fingers closed around hers, she felt the ghost of a chain wrapping around her wrist, dragging her back into the darkness she'd fought so hard to escape. The Duran estate rose from Chicago's North Shore like a monument to old money and older violence. Stone walls thick enough to stop bullets. Iron gates that had probably crushed more than one unwelcome visitor. Security cameras positioned at angles that left no blind spots, their red lights blinking like predator eyes in the darkness. Laura cataloged every detail from the back seat of Michael's armored SUV, her survival instincts overriding the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. She counted 12 cameras before they even reached the main entrance. Noted 3 possible exit points, though all were likely alarmed. Mapped the distance from the circular driveway to the tree line, calculating whether she could make it on foot if things went wrong. Michael watched her in the rearview mirror, his dark eyes missing nothing. Most people who saw the estate for the first time reacted with awe, their faces lighting up at the manicured gardens and Italian architecture, the kind of wealth that belonged in magazines. Laura looked at it like a soldier surveying enemy territory. She didn't gasp at the fountain imported from Tuscany. She checked for guard rotations. She didn't admire the antique lampposts lining the drive. She noted which ones could provide cover. Michael had brought many people to this house over the years. Business partners, politicians, women who thought proximity to power was seductive. None of them had ever looked at his home the way Laura did, like she was counting the bars on a cage. Jack rode between them, his massive head resting on Laura's thigh, his eyes never leaving her face. The dog hadn't stopped trembling since they left the restaurant. Every few minutes, a shudder would run through his muscular frame, and Laura's hand would move automatically to his neck, fingers finding the pressure points that seemed to calm him. She didn't appear conscious of the gesture. It was muscle memory, the kind that came from endless repetition in circumstances you'd rather forget. The living room was exactly what Laura expected. Leather furniture that cost more than she'd earn in 5 years. Original artwork on walls painted in colors with pretentious names like Midnight Sage and Storm Gray. A bar cart stocked with liquor bottles she couldn't pronounce, their amber contents catching the light from a chandelier that probably required its own insurance policy. But Laura barely registered the wealth. She was watching Michael's hands as he poured 2 glasses of something expensive, noting the slight tremor in his fingers that suggested he wasn't as controlled as his expression implied. She was tracking the positions of the 2 guards who'd followed them inside, memorizing their faces, their builds, which side they likely carried their weapons on. "Sit," Michael said, gesturing to the sofa with his glass. It wasn't a request. Laura remained standing, and something flickered across Michael's face. Surprise, maybe. People didn't usually disobey him in his own house. He set down the untouched drinks and turned to face her fully. "Where did you learn to handle him?" His voice was quieter now, stripped of the public authority he'd wielded at the restaurant. This was genuine curiosity, mixed with something darker. Suspicion, fear, perhaps, of answers he wasn't ready to hear. "I told you," Laura said, her voice hollow, rehearsed. "I had a dog like him once, before everything went wrong." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but it was safer than the truth. Safer than saying she'd spent 734 nights listening to this exact dog's breathing through a metal door, learning his patterns, his triggers, the specific tone of whimper that meant the handlers were coming. "Show me," Michael said, nodding toward Jack. The Rottweiler had positioned himself between them, not aggressively, just present, his attention split between the 2 humans who seemed to be negotiating his fate. Laura moved slowly, dropping into a crouch that made her knees protest. Her hands found Jack's fur, and she began the inspection she'd performed countless times in that basement. Not petting, assessing. Her fingers traced the ridge of scar tissue along his left shoulder where someone had burned him with cigarettes, checked his paws for the healed fractures from when handlers had slammed doors on his feet to teach him about consequences, examined his teeth, noting the chipped canine from when he'd tried to bite through his chain. Michael watched the clinical efficiency of her movements, the way she handled a dangerous animal with the detached competence of someone who'd studied veterinary medicine. There was no affection in her touch, no warmth, just procedural familiarity born from training she'd never finished. "You don't look at him with love, Laura," he said quietly, moving closer despite every instinct that probably warned him to maintain distance. "You look at him like you're checking a weapon for a safety catch." Laura's hand stilled in Jack's fur. She looked up at Michael, and the space between them felt charged with something electric and dangerous. He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and something darker, earthier. Close enough that she could see the tattoo that disappeared beneath his collar, some kind of script in a language she didn't recognize. The emotional distance between them was vast, an ocean of trauma and secrets and lies, but the physical proximity was suffocating, intense in a way that made Laura's pulse spike for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "That's because he is a weapon," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And weapons don't love you back. They just do what they're trained to do." Jack whimpered at her words, pressing closer, and Laura felt something crack in her chest, because she was lying again. The dog wasn't just a weapon, he was a victim, just like her, broken and reprogrammed, and forced to become something monstrous. And sitting here in Michael Duran's living room, Watching the mafia boss study her with those intense dark eyes, Laura realized something terrifying. Michael was broken too. Different circumstances, different scars, but the same fundamental damage. And broken things, she'd learned, either destroyed each other or understood each other in ways whole people never could. Laura waited until the estate fell silent before she moved. 3 a.m, when even the most dedicated security personnel grew complacent, when the human body naturally craved sleep despite training and discipline. Michael had offered her a guest room on the 2nd floor. All silk sheets and expensive furniture, like pretty packaging, could disguise a prison. She'd smiled, nodded, played the compliant victim he probably expected. Then she'd counted the minutes until his footsteps faded down the hall. The window opened with barely a whisper, old craftsmanship that prioritized function over security. Someone had assumed the estate's perimeter defenses made interior locks unnecessary. Their mistake. Laura had spent 2 years studying the smallest opportunities for escape, learning to exploit every oversight, every moment of human error. She'd gotten good at being patient, at waiting for the exact right second to move. The drop to the garden below was maybe 12 feet, manageable if she hung from the ledge first. Her hands found the stone sill, muscles remembering similar escapes from her childhood, before everything went dark. She landed in soft earth, her knees absorbing the impact, and immediately pressed herself against the foundation wall. Waited, listened. No alarms, no shouts, no floodlights snapping on to expose her. Just the ambient hum of the city beyond the walls, and the whisper of wind through manicured hedges. Laura moved low and fast, using the shadows between security lights, heading for the section of wall she'd identified from the car. The cameras had a rotation pattern, 30 seconds of overlap where a gap existed if you timed it perfectly. She'd counted it out in her head during dinner, during the stilted conversation where Michael had tried to extract more information and she'd given him nothing but careful half-truths. She made it halfway across the lawn before she heard the sound. Not footsteps, claws on grass. The rhythmic padding of something large moving with purpose. Laura's heart seized in her chest, adrenaline flooding her system with the familiar cocktail of fight or flight. She turned, already knowing what she'd see. Jack emerged from the shadows like a ghost made solid, his dark coat blending with the night, only his eyes visible, reflecting the distant security lights. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, positioning himself between Laura and her escape route. But he didn't attack, didn't snarl or bare his teeth or show any of the aggression he'd displayed at the restaurant. Instead, he began to circle her with methodical precision, his movements almost gentle as he nipped at her heels when she tried to sidestep, not biting, guiding, herding her back toward the house with the patient insistence of a sheepdog managing livestock. Laura tried to break past him, feinting left, then diving right, but Jack anticipated every move. He'd done this before, many times, with many girls. This wasn't protection, this was containment protocol. "No," Laura whispered, her voice cracking. "No, please, not again." She tried to run, desperation overriding strategy, but Jack moved faster, his larger body blocking her path, nudging her backward with his shoulder. Each touch was controlled, calculated, devoid of violence but absolutely implacable. He was driving her back toward the house, back toward captivity, and the realization hit Laura like a physical blow. She'd never escaped. She'd just traded one prison for another, and the same guard dog who'd kept her locked away before was doing it again. "He won't let you leave, Laura." Michael's voice cut through the darkness, calm and unsurprised. He stood on the stone porch, hands in his pockets, watching the scene unfold with the patience of someone who'd expected exactly this outcome. He's protective of the property. It's what he does. Something inside Laura snapped. The fear that had kept her silent, the careful self-preservation that had helped her survive, the willingness to swallow her truth to stay safe. All of it shattered. 2 years of buried rage erupted from her throat in a scream that scattered nightbirds from nearby trees. "He's not trained to protect the perimeter." Her voice was raw, feral, nothing like the compliant waitress she'd pretended to be. "He's trained to keep me inside. He wasn't my pet, Michael. He was the guard dog who sat outside my cell for 2 years while men hurt me, while I bled, while I begged. I don't love him. I survived him." The words hung in the night air like smoke from a funeral pyre, burning away every lie she'd told, every careful misdirection. Jack stopped moving, his ears flattening against his skull, a low whine building in his throat. Michael stood frozen on the porch, his expression shifting from control to confusion, to something that looked dangerously close to horror. "What are you saying?" His voice had lost its authority, reduced to something smaller, more human. "I'm saying your father's estate has a basement," Laura said, her whole body shaking now, trembling with the effort of finally speaking truth she'd kept buried. "And in that basement, there are cells. And in those cells, men kept girls they bought and sold and broke. And this dog, your precious Jack, he sat outside those cells and made sure none of us ever got out. He's not protecting you, Michael. He's doing what he was trained to do, keeping prisoners contained." Michael descended the porch steps slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. The power dynamic that had defined every interaction between them shifted violently, tectonic plates realigning. He wasn't the captor anymore, the dangerous man holding her against her will. He was something worse. He was the son standing in his father's shadow, realizing the legacy he'd inherited was built on horrors he'd never imagined. "My father," he started, then stopped, his voice failing. "Your father ran a trafficking ring," Laura said, the words tasting like poison and freedom simultaneously. "And I was in it, for 2 years, in a cell under your family's property. And when I finally escaped, I thought I'd never see this dog again. I prayed I wouldn't. But here we are." Jack sat down between them, his massive head swiveling from Laura to Michael and back again, confused by the shift in emotional energy. Michael stared at Laura like she'd just rewritten reality, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. And Laura, standing in the garden of her former prison with her secrets finally exposed, felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Not relief, exactly. But maybe the beginning of it, the first breath after drowning. Michael didn't sleep. He'd stood in his study until dawn broke over Lake Michigan, staring at the portrait of his father that dominated one wall, searching the painted eyes for answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. Giuseppe Duran had been a hard man, ruthless in business, unforgiving of weakness. But a trafficker? A man who kept women in cages? The accusation didn't align with Michael's memories, yet Laura's words had carried the weight of lived truth, the kind of knowledge that couldn't be fabricated. When the first light touched the horizon, Michael made a decision. He would prove her wrong. He had to. He found Laura in the kitchen, nursing black coffee with hands that still trembled slightly. She looked up when he entered, her expression wary, a deer calculating distance to the nearest exit. "I want to show you something," Michael said, his voice rough from exhaustion and cigarettes. "The grounds. I need you to understand you're a guest here, not a prisoner. If what you said is true, if there are cells somewhere on this property, we'll find them, together." Laura studied him for a long moment, searching for deception and finding only desperation. A powerful man unmoored by revelations that threatened everything he thought he knew about his bloodline. "All right," she said finally. "Show me." They walked through gardens that probably employed a full-time staff, past fountains and marble statuary, carefully pruned hedges shaped into geometric precision. Michael kept up a stream of information, identifying which ancestor had imported which feature, talking to fill the silence because quiet left too much room for the accusations hanging between them. Laura barely heard him. She was waiting for her body to remember, trusting the physical scars to guide her where memory had buried details too painful to revisit. They rounded a corner near the old guest house, entering an elaborate rose garden where late-season blooms still clung to their stems, and Laura stopped breathing. The smell hit her like a fist to the sternum. Damp earth, yes, but underneath it something else. Rot, sulfur. The specific combination of scents produced by poor ventilation and chemical toilets and human suffering. Her vision blurred at the edges, the manicured garden overlaying with memories of darkness and concrete. The sky tilted sideways. Her knees buckled. Michael caught her before she hit the ground, his arm steadying her weight. "Laura? What's wrong?" But she was already pulling away from him, dropping to her hands and knees near the guest house foundation, clawing at the earth with her bare fingers. Dirt packed beneath her nails, rose thorns caught her skin. She didn't notice. "Here," she gasped, her breathing rapid and shallow, panic tightening her chest like a vice. "The vent. The air came from here. I used to put my face against the grate, trying to smell anything that wasn't that place." Her fingers found the metal grate half buried in decorative stones, oxidized with age but still functional, still pulling stale air from somewhere below and releasing it into the garden where it would dissipate among the roses. Michael stared at the grate, then at the guest house, then back at Laura's shaking form. His face had gone pale beneath his olive complexion. "Santo cielo," he breathed. He pulled out his phone, barking orders in Italian too rapid for Laura to follow. Within minutes, 3 of his men appeared, carrying bolt cutters and a battering ram. They'd brought weapons too, Laura noticed. They thought they were breaching an enemy stronghold, not realizing the enemy had been dead for 3 years. The guest house basement lock resisted briefly before yielding to brute force. The door swung open on rusted hinges, revealing stairs that descended into blackness. Michael went first, his hand resting on the gun at his spine, his men flanking him with flashlights that cut through the dark like surgical instruments. Laura followed, each step down triggering muscle memory she'd tried to bury. 17 steps. She'd counted them every time the handlers came. 17 steps between the normal world and hell. The basement appeared ordinary at first glance. Storage boxes, old furniture, wine racks, but Michael's head of security, a man named Tommaso who'd served the family for 20 years, ran his hands along the far wall and found what he was looking for. A seam, barely visible, where supposedly solid concrete separated. He pushed, and a section of wall swung inward on a hidden pivot. The smell that rushed out made 2 of the men gag. Behind the false wall was a corridor. Soundproofed panels on the ceiling, industrial lighting, and doors. 4 of them, each with a small window reinforced with wire mesh, and a slot at the bottom for sliding food trays. Michael stood frozen in the corridor, his flashlight beam trembling slightly. Laura walked to the second door on the left. Her door. The metal was still scarred with scratches at dog height, deep gouges where Jack had dug at it when she'd screamed, when his training had warred with instinct and training had won. Michael approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. He touched the scratches, his fingers tracing the pattern Laura had memorized during endless nights. Then he opened the door. The cell was maybe 8 by 10 feet, a concrete slab for a bed, a chemical toilet, chains embedded in the walls, and scratched into the concrete above the bed, dozens of tally marks. Laura had counted every day of her captivity, needing to anchor herself to the passage of time when day and night became indistinguishable. 734, Laura said quietly from the doorway. 734 days. I stopped counting after I gave birth because I knew they'd never let me leave with the baby, so the days stopped mattering. Michael turned to look at her, and Laura saw her own trauma reflected in his eyes. The horror of realization, the knowledge that evil had flourished in his family while he'd lived upstairs, oblivious. My father, he said, his voice breaking on the word. I thought I knew what kind of man he was. Brutal, yes. Criminal, obviously. But this? Children? Not children, Laura corrected, her voice hollow. Girls. Teenagers to early 20s. Old enough that we knew exactly what was happening to us. Young enough that no one looked too hard when we disappeared. She stepped into the cell, and her presence there, alive and accusing, seemed to fill the small space with unbearable pressure. Your father didn't do this alone, Michael. Someone helped him. Someone ran this operation, and I need to know who. Because they took my baby, and I want him back. Michael stood in the center of the cell his father had built, surrounded by evidence of atrocities committed under his family's roof, and felt the foundation of his entire existence crack. Everything he'd believed about his legacy, his bloodline, his place in the world, all of it was contaminated by this discovery. And the woman standing before him, broken but undefeated, was offering him a chance at something he'd never considered before. Redemption. Then we find them, he said, his voice hardening with new purpose. We find everyone involved, and we make them pay. Laura couldn't feel her body. She walked through the main house like a ghost haunting the scene of its own death, her mind trapped somewhere between the cell downstairs and the present moment. Michael had tried to guide her to a sitting room, to offer her water or something stronger, but she'd pulled away from his touch and kept moving. Her feet carried her down hallways lined with family portraits, past rooms filled with furniture that cost more than lives, apparently, through the kind of wealth that could bury any secret deep enough that it never surfaced. Jack found her on the second floor, his claws clicking against hardwood as he trotted up behind her. He didn't bark or demand attention. He simply pressed his body against her legs, whining low in his throat, nudging her hip with his massive head. When Laura didn't respond, he moved in front of her, blocking her aimless path, and began herding her toward the east wing, with the same insistent pressure he'd used in the garden. But this felt different. Not containment. Urgency. What? Laura whispered, her voice distant even to her own ears. What do you want? Jack whined again, higher pitched, almost desperate. He pawed at her leg, gentle but insistent, then trotted a few steps down the corridor before turning back to make sure she followed. Laura's therapist had told her not to trust her instincts, that trauma rewired the brain to see danger everywhere. But standing in the hallway with a dog who'd been both her guard and her witness, Laura decided to trust something deeper than instinct. She followed. Jack led her to a door painted soft yellow, slightly ajar. Children's laughter drifted from inside, the bright sound of a cartoon playing on a tablet. Laura's hand found the door frame, steadying herself as she peered into the nursery. The room was everything a child could want, toys organized in bins by type and color, a bookshelf stuffed with picture books, alphabet letters marching across one wall in cheerful primary colors. And in the center of it all, building a tower from soft blocks, was a little boy. Michael appeared behind her, his footsteps quiet on the carpet. "That's Leo," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "My cousin Gianni's son. Gianni died in a car accident 2 years ago. His girlfriend, she died giving birth. There was no other family, so I took the baby in. He's been with me since he was 3 days old." Laura heard the words, but they seemed to come from very far away. She was watching Jack, who'd entered the nursery and walked directly to a small bed shaped like a race car. The Rottweiler lay down beside it with a heavy sigh, positioning his body in a specific posture Laura recognized instantly. Protective, vigilant, the exact same way he'd positioned himself outside her cell during the last trimester of her pregnancy, when her belly had been so swollen she could barely turn over on the concrete slab. The handlers had kept Jack closer then, using his presence to reinforce that escape was impossible, that she was being watched even in her most vulnerable moments. "How old is he?" Laura asked, though she already knew. Her body knew. Her breasts, which had stopped producing milk 2 years ago, suddenly ached with phantom memory. "Just turned 2, Michael said. His birthday was 2 months ago, September 15th. Laura's knees nearly gave out. She'd given birth on September 12th. They'd taken the baby before she'd even held him, told her he was stillborn, that he'd never taken a breath. She'd heard him cry, insisted she'd heard it, but they'd told her that was impossible, that grief was making her hear things. They'd left her in that cell with empty arms and breasts that wept milk for a ghost. And 3 days later, Michael Duran had welcomed a newborn into his home with a convenient story about a dead cousin. Leo looked up from his blocks, noticing the stranger in his doorway. He had dark curls and serious eyes, the kind of grave expression some children wear when they're naturally observant. "Hi," he said, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation of a toddler practicing words. "You pretty." Laura's vision blurred with tears. She walked into the nursery on legs that barely supported her weight, drawn to the child by a force stronger than gravity. She knelt beside him, close enough to smell the baby shampoo in his hair, the milk on his breath. "Hi, sweetheart," she managed, her voice cracking. "Can I see your tower?" Leo nodded enthusiastically, pointing to his creation. "Big. I make big." As he gestured, his shirt rode up slightly. Laura's breath caught. Without thinking, operating on maternal instinct that overrode everything else, she reached out and gently pulled back the collar of his shirt, revealing his left shoulder. The birthmark was small, maybe the size of a dime, shaped like a teardrop with an irregular edge, strawberry red against pale skin, identical to the one on Laura's left shoulder, the mark she'd inherited from her mother, who'd inherited it from hers. A genetic marker that ran through her family line like a signature. "He didn't die," Laura whispered, tears streaming down her face now, her whole body shaking. "They told me he was stillborn, that he never breathed, but he's here. He's alive." She looked up at Michael, who'd gone very still in the doorway, his face draining of color as he processed the implication. Laura rose slowly, her grief transforming into something sharper, more dangerous. Rage, the kind of fury that came from a mother who'd mourned a living child. She was no longer the frightened waitress or the broken victim. She was a woman who'd just found her stolen son. "Who gave him to you, Michael?" Her voice was steady now, cold and precise as a scalpel. "Who brought you this baby? Who told you the story about your cousin? Because I need a name." She stepped closer to him, and Michael actually backed up, recognizing something primal and unstoppable in her eyes. "I need to know who took my son from my arms and put him in yours. Who made you an accomplice to trafficking even if you didn't know it? Who's been pulling the strings this entire time?" Michael's mouth opened, closed. His mind was racing. Laura could see it, replaying every moment of Leo's arrival, every detail of the story he'd been told. "My mother," he said finally, the words tasting like betrayal. "Valeria. She brought him to me. She arranged everything. The paperwork, the death certificates, All of it. She said she was protecting family honor, keeping the Duran name from being associated with an illegitimate child. I never questioned it because she's my mother, and she'd never... He stopped, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She'd never traffic girls in the basement. She'd never poison a dog. She'd never do any of the things she's apparently been doing while I trusted her completely. Laura looked down at Leo, who'd gone back to his blocks, oblivious to the world-shattering revelations happening around him. Her son, alive, healthy, loved, apparently, by the man who'd unknowingly helped steal him. The situation was impossible, a knot that couldn't be untangled without someone getting hurt. But Laura had survived 2 years in hell. She could survive this too. Take me to her, Laura said, her voice hard enough to cut glass. Take me to Valeria, now. Valeria Duran held court in the solarium, like a queen receiving subjects. The afternoon sun filtered through glass panels, warming the marble floors and illuminating her silver hair, styled in an elegant chignon that probably required an hour and a professional. She wore cream silk, pearls at her throat, and the kind of composed expression that came from decades of practice hiding what she really thought. A Persian cat lounged on her lap, purring as she stroked its fur with manicured hands. The picture of refined matriarchal grace. Laura wanted to rip her throat out. Michael entered without knocking, his footsteps heavy with purpose, his entire body radiating barely controlled fury. Laura followed close behind, Jack pressing against her legs like a living shield. Valeria looked up from her tea, her expression shifting to mild surprise that didn't quite reach her calculating eyes. Michael, darling, I didn't expect you this afternoon, and you've brought a guest. Her gaze slid to Laura, dismissive and cold. The waitress from last night. How unexpected. We found it, Michael said, his voice tight enough to snap. No preamble, no deference to the woman who'd raised him. The basement, the cells, everything. He moved closer, looming over her chair, his shadow falling across her perfectly composed features. We found where Father kept them, where he trafficked girls, where he ran a business that you told me didn't exist. Valeria set down her teacup with a delicate clink, her movements unhurried. I see. She continued stroking the cat, which had started to purr louder, oblivious to the tension crackling through the room. And this girl told you these wild stories, did she? Fed you some tragic tale of captivity? Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile on someone with a soul. How predictable. It's not a story, Laura said, stepping forward despite the instinct to maintain distance from the woman who'd orchestrated her nightmare. I was there, in cell 2. For 2 years. Your husband's men kept me there. And when I gave birth, someone took my baby and told me he died. That same baby is upstairs right now, playing with blocks, calling himself Leo. Valeria's expression didn't change. No shock, no denial, no maternal horror at being accused of such monstrous crimes. Instead, she laughed. The sound was refined, practiced, the kind of laughter that graced charity galas and society events. Oh, Michael, she said, shaking her head with affectionate exasperation. You always were too soft-hearted. Your father worried about it constantly. She stood, setting the cat aside, and moved to the bar cart to refresh her tea. Your father wasn't weak in business, but he lacked vision. He saw those girls as a temporary revenue stream. I saw them as assets to be managed long-term. Michael's face went white. You're admitting it. You're actually admitting you ran a trafficking ring. I'm admitting I ran a business, Valeria corrected, adding sugar to her tea with steady hands. Your father was the face, yes, the enforcer, but I was the architect. I selected the properties. I managed the logistics. I kept the dog because it was useful, a tool that served its purpose efficiently. She took a sip, her eyes meeting Michael's over the rim of her cup. And when that business became too risky after your father's unfortunate heart attack, I liquidated the assets and pivoted to something more sustainable. Liquidated, Laura repeated, her voice shaking with rage. You mean you killed them? The other girls, you killed them rather than let them go. Valeria's silence was answer enough. She returned to her chair, crossing her ankles with practiced elegance. I kept the baby as insurance, she continued, speaking to Michael as if Laura wasn't even present. I knew someday you might start asking questions about your inheritance, about the sources of our wealth. Having Leo gave me leverage. A child you loved, whose legitimacy depended entirely on maintaining my version of events. Michael stood frozen, his entire worldview shattering in real time. He's not my cousin's son. There was no cousin. You fabricated everything." "Of course I did," Valeria said, waving her hand dismissively. "It was remarkably easy. Death certificates can be purchased. Desperate girls give birth without hospitals all the time. No one asks questions when a wealthy widow adopts her orphaned grandnephew." She turned her attention to Laura, her gaze sharpening. "She's a mentally ill whore, Michael. Look at her, dressed in borrowed clothes, shaking with hysteria, obsessed with you after one night. There was no baby. Leo is family. He's ours. And this unstable woman is trying to steal him with fabricated stories and manufactured evidence." For a moment, Michael wavered. Laura could see it in his eyes, the lifetime of trust warring with the evidence before him. He'd loved his mother unconditionally. She'd raised him after his father died. She'd guided him through taking over the family business. She'd been his constant, his foundation. And here she sat, composed and certain, making Laura sound like a delusional stalker, inventing trauma to gain access to wealth and power. Laura did look unstable. Her hair was disheveled from crawling through the basement. Her hands were dirty from clawing at the garden soil. Her eyes were wild with a mother's desperate grief. She had no proof beyond a birthmark that could be coincidence, memories that could be delusions, and a dog's behavioral patterns that could be explained away as simple training. Standing in the elegant solarium, surrounded by wealth and refinement, Laura looked exactly like what Valeria was describing. Crazy, obsessed, lying. "Show him," Laura said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror flooding her veins. "Show him the records, the real ones. You're too smart to run a business like that without documentation. You said you managed logistics, which means you kept books. Somewhere in this house, there's proof. Names, dates, transactions. Show him, or I will tear this entire estate apart until I find it." Valeria's composure cracked, just slightly. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Calculation. Concern. The look of a chess player realizing their opponent had seen 3 moves ahead. "Michael," she said, her voice softening, becoming maternal and warm. "You're not actually considering believing this disturbed woman over your own mother. I raised you. I protected you. I built this empire so you could inherit something worth having. Don't let her poison that bond with fantasies and accusations." Michael looked between them. His mother, elegant and composed, radiating the authority she'd wielded his entire life, and Laura, broken and furious, a stranger who'd brought nothing but chaos into his carefully ordered world. The tension in the room was suffocating, everyone waiting to see which version of reality he'd choose to believe, the comfortable lie or the unbearable truth. Michael left Laura in the guest room with instructions that felt more like confinement than protection. "Stay here while I investigate," he'd said, his voice hollow, a man walking through the ruins of his reality. "I need to verify things. I need to think." Then, he'd locked the door from the outside, and Laura understood she'd traded one prison for another. At least this cell had a private bathroom and a bed that didn't reek of chemicals and despair. She paced for the first hour, adrenaline making stillness impossible. Jack had followed her upstairs and positioned himself by the door, his massive body blocking the exit even though it was already locked. But as afternoon stretched toward evening, Laura noticed something wrong with the dog. He'd started pacing too, moving in tight circles, his movements becoming increasingly agitated. He snapped at the air, tracking things that weren't there. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites streaked with red that hadn't been visible this morning. Laura crouched beside him, her veterinary training kicking in despite everything else. She'd been 2 semesters away from her degree when she'd been taken, had dreamed of working in animal rehabilitation, helping creatures that couldn't advocate for themselves. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now, but the knowledge remained. She checked Jack's pupils, noted the dilation, watched how he flinched at sounds she could barely hear. "What's wrong with you?" she whispered, running her hands along his neck. Her fingers caught on his collar, and Jack yelped, pulling away from her touch. The reaction was extreme, disproportionate to the gentle pressure she'd applied. Laura examined the collar more carefully. It was expensive leather, studded with chrome, exactly the kind of accessory Valeria would choose. Elegant, practical, deadly. Laura brought it closer to her face and inhaled. Beneath the leather smell, there was something else, faint but distinct. Bitter almonds with a chemical undertone that made her nasal passages burn. Her blood went cold. She knew that smell. Had studied it in toxicology courses, learned to identify it as a warning sign. Cyanide compounds, yes, but also certain transdermal neurotoxins designed to absorb slowly through skin contact. The kind of poison that wouldn't kill outright but would degrade neurological function over time, increasing aggression, paranoia, violent outbursts, making a stable animal unstable, turning a guard dog into an unpredictable weapon. Laura's hands shook as she unbuckled the collar, Jack whimpering in relief as the leather came away from his skin. The inside of the collar showed discoloration where chemicals had seeped into the material, creating a constant contact poison that would deliver microdoses with every movement. She examined Jack's neck and found the telltale signs: skin irritation, hair loss in a perfect band, chemical burns that had been healing and reopening for God knew how long. "She's been poisoning you," Laura breathed, horror and rage mixing in equal measure. "Keeping you just sick enough to be dangerous but not sick enough to die. Making sure you'd attack when she needed you to. Making sure Michael would see you as a weapon instead of what you really are. A victim. Just like Laura. Just like all the girls in those cells. Just another tool Valeria had used and abused for her own purposes." Laura stood, gripping the collar in her fist, and began pounding on the locked door. "Michael! Michael, I need to talk to you. Now!" She didn't care if she sounded hysterical. Didn't care if this made Valeria's assessment of her mental state seem accurate. She pounded until her fists hurt, until she heard footsteps in the hallway, until the lock turned and Michael appeared, his face drawn with exhaustion. "What is it? I told you I need time to..." He stopped when he saw her expression, the collar dangling from her hand, Jack cowering behind her with his neck exposed and raw. "She's drugging him," Laura said, her voice steady with certainty. "Your mother. She's been poisoning Jack with a transdermal neurotoxin. That's why he attacked the busboy at the restaurant. That's why he's aggressive and unpredictable. She's not just keeping him as a weapon. She's actively making him into one." She thrust the collar toward Michael. "Smell it. Look at his neck. I studied veterinary nursing before I was taken. I know what chemical poisoning looks like. And this is textbook." Michael took the collar, his fingers finding the discolored interior. He brought it to his nose and recoiled, the bitter almond scent unmistakable once you knew to look for it. He knelt beside Jack, examining the raw skin, the pattern of burns that matched the collar's placement perfectly. His jaw tightened, muscles jumping beneath his skin. Why would she do this? His voice was barely audible. "He's just a dog. He's my father's dog. The last thing I have of him." "Exactly," Laura said. "He's your connection to your father, your loyalty to family. She's been using that loyalty against you. If Jack attacks someone important, someone you're doing business with, you take the fall. The dog is registered to you. The liability is yours. She can eliminate threats and keep herself clean." Laura moved closer, her voice gentler now. "She's turning him into a ticking time bomb pointed at your life. And when he finally snaps completely, when the poison breaks his mind beyond repair, you'll have to put him down yourself. She wins either way." Michael stood slowly, the collar crushed in his grip. His expression had shifted from doubt to something harder, colder, the look of a man who'd been played and finally saw the board. "We test it," he said. "I have a contact who runs a private lab, discreet. We send the collar, get confirmation of what's in it." He pulled out his phone, already dialing. "If you're right, if there's poison in this leather, then my mother isn't just a trafficker. She's actively trying to destroy me. She's trying to control you," Laura corrected. "There's a difference. Destroying you gives her nothing. But keeping you isolated, paranoid, dependent on her guidance because everyone else seems dangerous, that gives her everything." She watched his face as the pieces fell into place, understanding dawning in his dark eyes. "I'm the only person who's told you the truth since you met me, Michael. Your mother has been feeding you lies wrapped in maternal concern, and you believed her because who questions their mother?" the lab contact answered. Michael spoke in rapid Italian, arranging pickup and analysis within the hour. When he disconnected, he looked at Laura with something she hadn't seen before. Not suspicion, not desire, trust. The fragile, tentative beginning of it. "If the test comes back positive," he said quietly, "if you're right about this, then everything changes. My mother becomes my enemy. Leo becomes your son, and you become the only person in my life who isn't lying to me." "I know," Laura said. They stood in the doorway, the poisoned collar between them, Jack whimpering at their feet. Outside, the sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere in this house, Valeria was probably sipping tea, confident in her control, certain that her son would choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. But she'd made a mistake. She'd underestimated a mother's rage. And she'd underestimated what happened when you finally pushed a man too far. The test would take 6 hours. By midnight, they'd have proof. And by dawn, Valeria's carefully constructed empire would begin to burn. The lab results came back at 11:47. Transdermal neurotoxin, concentration high enough to cause permanent neurological damage with prolonged exposure. Chemical composition matched compounds used in experimental military applications, the kind that required significant resources and connections to acquire. Michael had stared at the report for a full minute, his knuckles white where he gripped the paper, before making a decision. They couldn't simply have Valeria arrested. She controlled too many people, had too many connections in law enforcement and politics. Half the organization answered to her, not him. They needed something more permanent, more public, more devastating. The gala, he'd said, looking up at Laura with cold purpose. My mother's annual charity event. Tomorrow night. Every important family in Chicago will be there. Every politician she's bought. Every business partner she's cultivated. We expose her in front of everyone. Make it impossible for her to deny or disappear. Now, 24 hours later, Laura stood in front of a mirror in Michael's master suite, barely recognizing her reflection. The woman staring back at her wore midnight blue silk that hugged every curve, a dress that probably cost more than 3 months of her waitress salary. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, borrowed from the Duran family vault, each piece worth enough to start a new life somewhere far from Chicago. A stylist had tamed her hair into an elegant updo, applied makeup that made her look sophisticated rather than scared. Michael appeared behind her in the mirror, devastating in a black tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and the dangerous grace of his movements. He met her eyes in the reflection, then stepped closer, his hands settling on her bare shoulders. His lips brushed against her neck, just below her ear, and Laura felt heat flood through her despite everything. Tonight, you are not the victim, he murmured against her skin. You are the evidence. You are the testimony that destroys her empire. You are a queen walking into battle. Laura turned in his arms, her hands finding his chest, feeling his heartbeat through expensive fabric. And what are you? She asked quietly. The executioner, Michael said. The son choosing justice over blood. He kissed her then, properly, and Laura kissed him back with the desperation of two broken people finding something whole in each other. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Michael rested his forehead against hers. After tonight, everything changes. Leo becomes your son legally. My mother goes to prison or worse, and you and I figure out what we are to each other without all these lies between us. The gala was already in full swing when they arrived. The estate's grand ballroom glittered with hundreds of guests in formal wear, champagne flowing, a string quartet playing in the corner. Valeria held court near the marble fireplace, resplendent in emerald green, accepting compliments and donations with practiced grace. Her eyes found Michael and Laura across the room, and something flickered in their depths. Calculation, concern. She hadn't expected him to bring the waitress to her event. Laura scanned the crowd, her survival instincts cataloging exits and potential threats. Her gaze snagged on a familiar face working behind the bar. The busboy from the Onyx room, the one who dropped the tray. The one whose eyes had held knowledge rather than fear when Jack attacked. He was here, dressed in server's attire, pouring drinks and making small talk. And as Laura watched, he made direct eye contact with Valeria. A signal. A confirmation. The conspiracy wasn't just mother and son. It ran deeper. Michael saw it too. His hand tightened on Laura's waist. That's one of them, she whispered, from the restaurant. He triggered Jack deliberately. He's working with her. Then he's about to make a mistake, Michael said. He guided Laura through the crowd, introducing her to business partners and politicians, establishing her presence, making sure everyone saw her at his side. They were creating witnesses, building a narrative. When the confrontation came, there would be no doubt about who said what, who stood where. Laura excused herself to find the restroom, but really she needed air, needed a moment away from the performance. She slipped into the library, a quiet room lined with books that probably hadn't been read in decades. She was standing by the window, looking out at the garden where she'd clawed at the earth days ago, when she heard the door lock behind her. The busboy stood blocking the exit, his server's smile replaced with something cold and predatory. You should have stayed dead, he said, pulling a knife from inside his jacket. The blade caught the lamplight, 8 inches of steel meant for close work. Valeria said you were going to be a problem. She was right. He moved fast, trained movements that spoke of experience. But Laura had spent 2 years learning to read violence before it happened, to anticipate attacks, to survive by being faster and smarter than stronger opponents. She grabbed a heavy bookend, hurled it at his face. He dodged, but it bought her seconds. She screamed Michael's name, knowing he'd hear, knowing security would respond. The library door exploded inward. Jack burst through ahead of Michael, his massive body launching into the room with terrifying speed. The busboy's hand went to his pocket, pulling out a small device, a clicker, the aggression trigger he'd used at the restaurant. He clicked it twice, the sound sharp in the confined space, and Jack froze mid-charge. Laura could see the war happening inside the dog, his training, beaten into him over years, screaming at him to attack the nearest target. The poison that had corrupted his neurological pathways, making violence feel like the only response. But the collar was gone now. The constant chemical drip had stopped, and Jack's eyes, bloodshot but clearer than they'd been in months, moved between the busboy and Laura. Laura didn't hesitate. She began to hum. Lavender blue, dilly dilly, lavender green. The lullaby from the basement. The song that had kept him calm when everything else was chaos. Jack's ears swiveled toward her voice. The tension in his muscles shifted, and when the busboy clicked again, desperately trying to trigger the attack protocol, Jack made his choice. He ignored the clicker completely, turned away from the programming, and launched himself at the busboy with focused precision, his jaws clamping around the wrist holding the knife. The busboy screamed. The blade clattered to the hardwood floor. Jack stood over him, one massive paw on his chest, teeth bared, waiting for Laura's command, not attacking further, not killing, just containing, waiting for permission that Laura refused to give. Michael filled the doorway, gun drawn, his security team flanking him. He took in the scene instantly. The knife on the floor, the busboy pinned beneath Jack, Laura standing unharmed but shaking. "He tried to kill me," Laura said, her voice surprisingly steady. "On your mother's orders." He admitted it before Jack stopped him. Michael's expression went cold as winter. He looked at the busboy, then at Jack, then at Laura. "Bring him," he said to his men. "And find my mother. It's time for everyone to learn the truth about the Duran family business. All of it." Michael dragged the busboy onto the temporary stage that had been erected in the garden for Valeria's charity auction. The man's face was bloodied from Jack's intervention, his wrist already swelling where teeth had crushed bone. The string quartet faltered into silence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. 300 of Chicago's elite turned to watch as their host, Michael Duran, hauled a server onto the platform like a trophy. "My apologies for the interruption," Michael said, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet with practiced authority. "But I think it's time we discussed what charity actually means in the Duran household." He shoved the busboy forward, and the man stumbled, barely catching himself. "This man just attempted to murder my guest, on orders from my mother, the same woman currently accepting your donations for her foundation." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Valeria stood frozen near the fireplace, her emerald dress suddenly looking less regal and more like costume jewelry on a con artist. But her composure held. She set down her champagne and moved toward the stage with measured steps, her expression perfectly calibrated to convey maternal concern. "Michael, darling, you're not well. The stress of running the business has been too much. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "We're done with private," Michael said. He gestured to Tommaso, who stepped forward carrying a leather-bound ledger. "This is the real foundation, the one my mother has been running for 15 years. A trafficking operation based in the guest house basement. Girls as young as 15, bought, sold, and disposed of when they became inconvenient." He opened the ledger, began reading names and dates that made several guests go pale. Recognition, complicity. Some of these families had known, some had participated. Valeria's mask cracked, just slightly. Her eyes went cold, calculating, scanning for exits and finding them blocked by Michael's security. She was cornered, and cornered predators were most dangerous. Her hand slipped into her evening bag, and when it emerged, she was holding something small and silver. A whistle, elegant and deadly, the kind of weapon that looked decorative until you understood its purpose. "You always were too sentimental, Michael," Valeria said, her voice losing its warmth, becoming the sharp instrument of someone used to wielding power without mercy. "Just like your father, unable to do what's necessary." She raised the whistle to her lips. "Let me show you what happens to sentiment." She blew. The sound was inaudible to human ears, a frequency designed specifically for canine neurological systems. But Jack heard it. The high-pitched assault hit his damaged nervous system like a sledgehammer to the brain. He screamed, a sound Laura had never heard from him before, primal and broken. His body convulsed. Blood vessels in his eyes burst, red spreading across the whites, and then he went berserk. Blind with agony, operating on pure pain-driven instinct, Jack launched himself at the nearest heat signature, Michael. Laura saw it happening in slow motion, the massive Rottweiler charging toward the man she'd come to trust, toward Leo's protector, toward the only person who'd chosen truth over comfortable lies. Words wouldn't work. The frequency was too loud, drowning out everything else. Laura needed something louder. She grabbed the pistol from the guard nearest her, ignoring his surprised protest. She didn't aim it at Jack. She ran toward him, intercepting his charge, and wrapped her arm around his neck from behind, held him close despite his thrashing, despite the risk, despite every instinct screaming at her to let go. And then she pressed the gun barrel directly against his ear and fired. The blast was deafening in the garden. Guests screamed and dove for cover. The gunshot echoed off stone walls and glass, and inside Jack's skull, his eardrum ruptured instantly, then the other. As Laura shifted and fired again on the opposite side, the high-frequency torture from Valeria's whistle vanished, replaced by absolute silence. No more pain, no more commands, just quiet. Jack's rage drained away like water from a broken dam. His thrashing stopped. He stood trembling in Laura's arms, confused by the sudden absence of agony, his damaged eyes trying to focus on her face. Laura released him, stepped back, and made a hand signal she'd taught him in the basement. A gesture they'd developed when verbal commands were too risky, when silence meant survival. Her hand moved from her heart to point directly at Valeria. The sign meant protect. It meant threat. It meant stop her. Jack turned. His deaf ears couldn't hear Valeria's sharp intake of breath, couldn't hear Michael shouting for him to stand down, couldn't hear the chaos erupting around them. But he could see, he could smell, and he recognized the woman who'd been poisoning him, who'd turned him into a weapon against the people he'd learned to trust. Jack bypassed Michael completely, moving with focused purpose toward Valeria. She tried to run. Her heels caught on the stage steps. She went down hard, emerald silk tangling around her legs. And Jack was there, his massive body pinning her to the ground, his scarred jaws hovering inches above her throat. Not biting, not killing, just waiting, holding her for judgment. Laura hadn't given the command to attack, only to protect. And Jack, finally free from the poison and pain, finally able to choose, made the decision to show the mercy he'd never been shown. Michael's loyalists moved in, hauling Valeria to her feet, her dignity shattered along with her empire. Federal agents, who'd been waiting for Michael's signal, emerged from the crowd with badges and handcuffs. The ledger contained enough evidence to bury her for life. Multiple lives, generations of suffering documented in her precise handwriting. 6 months later, the guest house was gone. Michael had burned it to the ground personally, standing with Laura and Leo as flames consumed the building where nightmares had been manufactured. The cells were ash, the chains were melted slag. The basement that had held so much suffering was filled with concrete and sealed forever. Now, on a quiet spring afternoon, Laura sat on the porch watching Leo play in the grass. The boy knew her as Mama now, knew Michael as his guardian, understood in the way children do that his family was unconventional but entirely his. Jack lay nearby in a patch of sunlight, his deaf ears unable to hear the birds, but his entire body relaxed in a way it had never been before. He was calm, safe, loved not as a weapon but as a survivor who'd earned his peace. Michael emerged from the house carrying lemonade, settling beside Laura with his hand finding her knee like it belonged there. "The prosecutor called," he said quietly. "Valeria took a plea, life without parole. She gave up the names of everyone involved in exchange for avoiding death row." Laura nodded, watching Leo stack blocks with the intense concentration only toddlers possessed. "Good," she said. "Let them all burn." She leaned into Michael's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. The evidence that shattered lives could be rebuilt if you found the right person to help hold the pieces together. They were a family forged in hell, built from trauma and truth, and the stubborn refusal to let evil win. But they were living in the light now, and that was enough. If this story of broken souls and fierce loyalty kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to follow for more dark romance thrillers. Did you see that twist coming about the mother? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, remember, sometimes the monster under the bed is the only one who can save you.